Catherine Whitmore pressed both hands flat against her trunk and breathed in slow. She wasn't supposed to be afraid. She'd spent the last 3 years convincing herself she wasn't afraid of anything. Not Victor's temper, not society's whispers, not the slow suffocation of a life built around a man's approval. But standing at the gate of Blackthorn Estate, with the summer heat pressing down like judgment, her hands were shaking. Victor had smiled when he told her where she was going. That smile was what haunted her most. Drop a comment below. Tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if no one's told you today, you deserve better than what they handed you. Subscribe. Stay with me all the way to the end, and let's find out if Catherine got what she deserved. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday. Catherine Whitmore remembered that detail with uncomfortable precision, the way the morning light had cut through the parlor window, the way her tea had gone cold before she thought to drink it, the way Victor Hamilton had set the envelope on the table between them, like it was nothing more than a dinner invitation. "You'll go to Blackthorn Estate," he'd said, not looking up from his own correspondence. "The Duke requires a woman of competence. I've volunteered your services." She'd stared at him. "I beg your pardon." "You heard me, Catherine." "Victor." She set her cup down carefully, the way she did everything around him, carefully, precisely, without giving him anything to use against her. "We are engaged to be married. You cannot simply volunteer me to another man's household." He'd looked up then. Victor Hamilton had the kind of face that society called distinguished, sharp jaw, pale eyes, the easy confidence of a man who'd never once been told no by anyone who mattered. He looked at her the way he looked at all his possessions, with the mild satisfaction of ownership. "Duke Edward Blackthorn is dying," Victor said. "Everyone knows it. He needs someone to manage his affairs until the estate passes to his cousin. I've told him you're skilled at organization and management. It's a temporary arrangement. 3 months, perhaps 4. And our engagement? We'll be here when you return." He smiled. "If you return." That smile, that particular practiced smile that never reached his eyes. Catherine had asked what he meant by that. Victor had simply returned to his letters. She understood now, standing at the iron gate of Blackthorn Estate, with her single trunk behind her and the Carolina summer bearing down on everything like a hot hand pressed to the back of her neck, that she hadn't understood anything at all. The gate was old iron worked into climbing vines that might have been beautiful once. The house beyond it rose 3 stories against a white sky, all dark brick and shuttered windows. The kind of house that had seen generations come and go, and hadn't much cared about any of them. A few of the upper floor shutters hung crooked. The garden had gone untended, not wild, not romantic, just neglected in the specific way of a place where the person in charge had stopped caring. A man in dusty livery opened the gate without speaking. "I'm Miss Catherine Whitmore," she said. "I was sent by Mr. Victor Hamilton. I'm here to see the Duke." The man, older, weathered, with the kind of face that had forgotten how to be surprised, looked her over once. "Yes, ma'am, he's expecting you." A pause. "More or less." She followed him up the gravel drive. Around her, cicadas screamed in the heat. The summer of 1814 had come in hard and mean, the kind of summer that made tempers short and wells run dry, and the grounds of Blackthorn Estate felt every degree of it. The grass along the drive had yellowed in patches. Someone had started trimming the hedgerow and stopped halfway through. "The Duke," Catherine said, keeping her voice neutral. "How is his health presently?" The man ahead of her didn't turn around. "He has good days and poor days, ma'am." And today, a pause. Not a good day. She'd prepared herself for the smell. That was what the rumors all said, that Duke Edward Blackthorn was rotting from the inside out, that his illness had progressed to the point of physical decay, that a person couldn't stand to be in the same room with him. Victor had repeated those rumors with a kind of relish she hadn't examined too carefully at the time. She examined it now, walking up those front steps, and felt something cold settle in her chest. Victor had sent her here knowing. Whatever she was walking into, Victor Hamilton had known exactly what it was. The interior of the house hit her with a wave of stale air and deep shadow. The drapes in the entry hall were drawn against the heat, and the darkness after the bright exterior made her blink and pause. She heard the man ahead of her keep walking, heard the soft strike of her own boots on marble, heard from somewhere above the low sound of a man's voice in pain. She stopped. "Is that— This way, ma'am." She followed him up the staircase. The sound grew clearer as they ascended, not a cry exactly, but the controlled, deliberate vocalization of someone managing pain they could not afford to show fully. A man's pride in a single sound, struggling and losing. The liveryman stopped before a door at the end of the upper hall and knocked twice. Silence. Then, "Come." The voice was low. Rough with illness, yes, but underneath that roughness was something else, a precision, a careful command. The voice of a man who chose his words and meant them. The man opened the door and stepped aside. Catherine walked in. Duke Edward Blackthorn was not rotting. He was thin, far too thin, the kind of lean that spoke of long illness rather than constitution. His cheekbones sharp and his collar loose where it should have sat close. He was propped against the headboard with the deliberate arrangement of a man who'd made peace with being confined to a bed, but refused to look like he'd accepted it. His hair was dark and unwashed, his jaw unshaved by perhaps 3 days, and his eyes pale gray, steady, and absolutely alert found her immediately. He was watching her the way she'd been trained to watch patients. She realized with a small jolt that she was doing the same to him. "Miss Whitmore," he said, not a question. "Your Grace." She stepped fully into the room. She kept her chin level, her hands easy at her sides, and did not look away. "I was sent by Victor Hamilton." Something moved in his expression. Gone before she could name it. "I know who sent you," he said. "The question I've been sitting here asking myself since yesterday morning is why. He told me you required assistance with— I didn't request anyone." The Duke's voice was flat. "I want you to understand that clearly, Miss Whitmore. I did not request a woman to come manage my household. I did not send for you. Victor Hamilton contacted my solicitor and presented you as a necessary arrangement, which I was given very little opportunity to refuse while I am—" He paused. The pause cost him something. "While I am as I am." Catherine stood very still. She thought about Victor's smile. She thought about the words, "if you return." She thought about the way he'd given her very specific instructions about where her trunk should be placed in her room, as though she would be there long enough to unpack it properly, as though he'd thought carefully about the duration of her stay. "Your Grace," she said, "what exactly did Victor Hamilton tell your solicitor about the nature of this arrangement?" The Duke looked at her for a long moment. "He told him," Edward said slowly, "that you were his to lend, that you'd been causing trouble in his household, that a period of useful service elsewhere would settle your spirits and repay a debt you apparently owe him." A pause. "He described you as, and I'm quoting the letter my solicitor read to me, a difficult woman in need of correction." The room was very quiet. Outside a bird called once and went silent. Catherine heard her own breathing. She heard the precise, careful way she was keeping it even. She heard the blood in her ears, and the distant screaming of the cicadas, and the soft, terrible clarity of understanding arriving all at once. Victor hadn't lent her to a dying man who needed help. Victor had sent her to a dying man's house to get rid of her. She didn't know what she'd done. She didn't know what she'd learned, or what she'd nearly discovered, or what small, inconvenient threat she'd posed, simply by existing in his orbit with her eyes open. But Victor Hamilton had placed her here deliberately, in a house with a sick man and no chaperone and no allies, in a situation where anything might happen to a woman and be attributed to misfortune. "Miss Whitmore!" She blinked. Edward Blackthorn was watching her. His gray eyes hadn't moved. "Sit down," he said. "You've gone the color of old plaster." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You've just realized something that I've had the luxury of thinking about since yesterday. Sit down before you fall down, and then tell me what you intend to do about it." She sat. Not because he'd told her to, because the chair was behind her knees, and her legs had decided independently of her pride that sitting was the reasonable choice. She sat, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she looked at Duke Edward Blackthorn. This man who was supposed to be rotting, this man who was supposed to be dying, this man. She'd been traded to like a debt payment, and she took a slow breath. "What do you know about Victor Hamilton?" she asked. The Duke's mouth shifted, not quite a smile. More than he'd like. "Then we may have something to discuss. We may." He shifted against the headboard and the movement cost him. She saw it in the tightening around his eyes, the controlled exhale. "But first I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." "All right. What do you know about illness, the actual management of it? Not society's version, not the pretty story, the real thing." Catherine looked at him steadily. "My mother was ill for 11 years. I managed her care from the time I was 14 until she passed when I was 25. I kept records. I corresponded with 3 physicians. I administered treatments, adjusted dosages, tracked symptom patterns over weeks and months." She paused. "I know what incompetent medical care looks like, Your Grace, and I know what it costs." The silence stretched. Then Edward Blackthorn said very quietly, "The Dr. Victor Hamilton recommended to my estate 6 months ago is a man named Jonathan Fields." Catherine went still. "You know that name," the Duke said. "I know that name. Dr. Jonathan Fields." She knew that name the way she knew the smell of an old wound. A recognition that bypassed thought and went straight to the body. Jonathan Fields had attended her mother for 2 of those 11 years. 2 years during which her mother had done nothing but decline, during which every symptom Catherine had flagged had been dismissed, during which a simple dietary adjustment Catherine had proposed at 19 years old had been refused as female hysteria. An adjustment that, when finally implemented by a different physician, had given her mother 3 additional years of relative comfort. Jonathan Fields. Victor Hamilton's recommendation. She looked at the man in the bed before her. Too thin, too pale, controlled pain. A face that hadn't been tended to properly in days. She stood up. "May I see your treatment records?" she asked. Edward looked at her. "My treatment records?" "Yes. Whatever Dr. Fields has been prescribing, whatever schedule he's established, whatever documentation exists of your symptoms and his responses to them. I want to see all of it." A pause. "You walked into this room not 20 minutes ago." "I know. You've just learned your fiancé delivered you here as disposal. I'm aware. And your response is to ask for my medical records." Catherine looked at him squarely. "Your Grace? I can either spend the next hour being upset about Victor Hamilton, or I can spend it doing something useful. I've spent enough hours of my life being upset about men who didn't deserve the time. I'd rather be useful." She held his gaze. "May I see the records?" Something in his expression shifted. The careful, guarded watchfulness that had been there since she walked in didn't go away exactly, but it moved, made room for something else. Something that might have been, if she was reading him right, the very early beginnings of respect. "Thomas," the Duke called. The liveryman still in the doorway straightened. "Your Grace." "Bring Miss Whitmore the files from the lower study, all of them. Everything Fields has submitted since February." Thomas hesitated. "All of them, sir. Every page." After Thomas left, the room went quiet again. Catherine stood near the window, not close enough to see out, just close enough to feel the thin movement of air around the curtain edge. The heat was tremendous. She was aware suddenly of how long she'd been traveling, of the dust on her boots, of the fact that she hadn't eaten since early morning. She was also aware of the Duke watching her. "You should know," Edward said, "that Victor Hamilton visited this estate in March, before the illness had progressed to this." A gesture brief and controlled that indicated the bed, the curtains, the whole diminished state of things. "We had business dealings. I discovered in the course of those dealings that Hamilton had been misrepresenting certain financial arrangements. Not to me directly, to a third party who trusted him." A pause. "I was preparing to make that information known, and then in April I became very ill very quickly." Catherine turned from the window. "You think he poisoned you," she said. "I think Jonathan Fields arrived at this estate in April, prescribed a treatment regimen that has not improved my condition in 4 months, and that Victor Hamilton selected Jonathan Fields." Edward's voice was steady, factual. The voice of a man who'd had months to reach this conclusion, and had arrived at it carefully. "I cannot prove it. I've been too ill to act on it, and I have had no one in this house whom I trusted to act on my behalf." The words landed simply. Catherine heard them for what they were. "Until now," she said. "You tell me, Miss Whitmore." His gray eyes were direct. "Victor Hamilton sent you here to disappear quietly. Clearly you've decided not to do that. The question is what you intend instead." She thought about her mother. 11 years, 3 physicians, the record-keeping no one had thought to take seriously. The knowledge she'd built year by year in the margins of society, in the hours no one had valued, in the careful, meticulous labor of a woman who'd had no formal standing but had refused to stop learning. She thought about Victor's smile. She thought about the trunk she'd packed carefully, not knowing why she'd brought the leather case with her mother's medical notes, only knowing that she never traveled without it. "I intend," Catherine said quietly, "to find out what Jonathan Fields has been giving you. I intend to understand why you aren't improving. And I intend—" She paused. "I intend to make sure that when this is over, Victor Hamilton cannot smile like that at anyone ever again." The Duke looked at her for a long, measured moment. Then, "Thomas tells me the south guest room has a decent window and its own writing table. I'll have your trunk moved there." "Thank you, Your Grace." "Edward." He said it simply, without ceremony. "If we're going to do this, we're going to dispense with formality. It wastes time." Catherine looked at him. This man who was supposed to be dying. This man who had looked at her in the first 60 seconds and seen not a problem or a convenience or a woman to be managed, but a question worth asking. "Catherine, then," she said. Thomas arrived with the files 20 minutes later, a stack of papers nearly 2 inches thick, filled with Jonathan Fields' cramped, confident handwriting. Catherine sat at the writing table they'd moved from the guest room to the Duke's chamber, spread the first pages before her, and began to read. Outside, the Carolina summer pressed against the windows. The cicadas screamed. The heat was relentless and indifferent. Inside, a woman who had been traded like a debt and a man who had been left to die quietly began between them to decide that they would do neither. The first thing Catherine noticed was the handwriting. Jonathan Fields wrote with the confidence of a man who expected no one to question him. Large, sweeping letters, the kind of script that announced itself before you'd read a word. She'd seen that handwriting before on her mother's chart, on the dismissal letters he'd sent to the second physician, who dared suggest a different approach. She recognized it the way you recognize the face of someone who once hurt you immediately in the stomach, before the mind caught up. She spread the pages across the writing table and began sorting them by date. February, March, April, May, June, July. The stack grew as she worked, each month its own small pile, each pile its own evidence. Edward watched her from the bed. He didn't speak for the first several minutes, and she appreciated that. There were men who filled silence because they couldn't stand it, who narrated their own importance into every quiet moment. Edward Blackthorn was not that kind of man. He waited. He watched. And when he finally did speak, it was because he had something worth saying. "Fields visits every Tuesday," he said. "He stays approximately 40 minutes. He asks me the same 5 questions every time." "What 5 questions? How is your appetite? Are you sleeping? Is the pain manageable? Have you been outside? Do you feel stronger?" A pause. "He writes down whatever I tell him and then adjusts nothing." Catherine looked up from the February records. "He's never adjusted the treatment protocol. Once. In May, I told him the nausea was severe enough that I couldn't keep food down for 3 days running. He added a second compound to the evening dose." She watched his jaw tighten. "I was sicker for 2 weeks after that." She turned back to the May records and found it immediately, a notation in Fields's hand, a new compound, a dosage increase. She cross-referenced it against the symptom notes from the same period, which were written in a different hand. Smaller, more careful. Someone else had been keeping a secondary record. "Who wrote these?" She held up the secondary pages. "Thomas, my man who met you at the gate. He started keeping his own notes in March because he didn't trust Fields and didn't know what else to do." Edward's voice was dry. Thomas has been with this family for 31 years. He doesn't read well, but he copies down what he sees and hears with the accuracy of a man who understands the value of evidence. Catherine looked at Thomas's careful, uneven handwriting, painstaking columns of dates, symptoms, what was administered Edward's visible condition the following morning. It was imprecise by any medical standard. It was also the most honest record in the entire stack. She began reading it against Field's official record. The first discrepancy appeared in March. Fields had recorded Edward's appetite as improving. Thomas had written in his careful block letters, DUK, not eat soup PR. Said stomach bad again. The second discrepancy appeared in April. Fields had noted, patient reports reduced pain. Thomas had written DUK up half night, heard him through the door. By the time she reached June, Catherine had found 11 discrepancies. She sat back in her chair. Edward. He'd been watching her face. You found something. Fields has been falsifying his records. She kept her voice level because she needed to be sure before she said the next part. Not dramatically. Not in ways that would be obvious at a glance. Small adjustments framing your condition as more stable than it is indicating improvement where Thomas's record suggests the opposite. She paused. Someone reading these official records would conclude that you are a man recovering slowly, but consistently under competent care. Someone reading Thomas's record would conclude something very different. The silence in the room changed quality. How different? Edward asked. That you've been declining since April, at a rate that should have prompted significant intervention. She chose her next words carefully. And that the compound added in May made you worse, not better, and Fields either didn't notice or didn't care. Edward was quiet for a moment. Outside, the heat pressed on. A clock somewhere in the house marked the quarter hour. Say the rest of it, he said. The compound he added in May. Catherine pulled the relevant page forward. It's recorded here as a digestive tonic. Standard enough, but the dosage is higher than I'd expect for that application. And the primary ingredient at this concentration over this duration. She stopped. I need to verify this against my mother's notes. But if I'm reading this correctly, the long-term effect of this compound at this dose would not be to aid digestion. It would be to compound the body's inability to absorb nutrition. Slowly, consistently, in a way that would look from the outside like a man wasting from illness rather than, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Rather than being poisoned, Edward said quietly. I don't want to say that word until I'm certain. I've been thinking it since June. His voice was flat. Not angry past anger into something colder and more deliberate. I've been lying here thinking it, and having no way to prove it, and no one I could say it to who wouldn't either dismiss me or panic. He looked at her directly. You're not dismissing me. No, and you're not panicking. Not yet. She almost smiled. Give me time. Something shifted in his expression, brief, involuntary, gone quickly. But she caught it. A crack in the careful control, something almost warm. What do you need? He asked. My mother's case notes. They're in the leather case in my trunk. She was already standing. And I need to know what Thomas has been giving you directly, not what Fields prescribed, but what Thomas actually administered. I want to know if those are the same thing. She crossed to the door, pulled it open, and nearly walked directly into Thomas himself, who was standing in the hallway with the expression of a man who had not been eavesdropping and was deeply committed to that story. Thomas, she said, the leather case in my trunk. Top of the pile, brown brass clasps. Bring it here. Yes, ma'am? He hesitated. You found something in those records. I found several things. She met his eyes. You kept good notes. The old man's expression did something complicated, pride and worry and relief all arriving at once. I didn't know if they'd matter. Something didn't sit right. Every Tuesday that man came and left, and the Duke weren't no better, and I thought somebody ought to be writing this down. You were right to think it. She held his gaze. Has there ever been a Tuesday when you watched Fields prepare the evening dose? Thomas's jaw shifted. Once, back in May. He were later than usual and had to prepare it himself here instead of sending it from his bag already done. A pause. He didn't know I were in the hall. What did you see? 2 bottles, not 1. He put a measure from the second bottle in with the regular dose. Didn't write nothing down while he did it. Then he put the second bottle back in his bag real quick. Thomas looked at her steadily. I didn't know what it meant. It means, Catherine said, that you may have just saved his life. She held the old man's gaze for one more moment. Get me that case. She was back at the writing table within 10 minutes, her mother's notes spread alongside Field's records. The leather case held 11 years of observation, her own handwriting in the margins. Corrections, cross-references, the careful accumulating knowledge of someone who'd had to learn everything the hard way, because no one had seen fit to teach her properly. She found what she was looking for in the 4th notebook. A compound, a dosage threshold. Her own notation at 19 years old, underlined twice. At this concentration, over 8 weeks accelerates decline. Mimics natural wasting. Physician dismissed this. I am certain. Her physician had been Jonathan Fields. She sat with that for exactly 3 seconds. Then she stood up. I need to see your hands, she said. Edward looked at her. My hands. Hold them out. He did slowly. She crossed to the bed and examined them, the nail beds, the knuckle skin, the faint tremor she'd noticed earlier that she hadn't commented on. She asked him to follow her finger with his eyes. She asked him about his vision, about any ringing in his ears, about whether the nausea was worse in the morning or evening. He answered all of it without asking why. You've had no dose since when? She asked. Thomas hasn't given me the evening compound since Sunday. He said it made him uneasy, and he wanted to wait until... Edward paused. He said he wanted to wait until someone came who might know better. She turned and looked at Thomas in the doorway. The old man met her eyes and said nothing. That was 4 days ago, Catherine said. Yes. She thought about 4 days. She thought about the tremor and the nail beds and the clarity in his eyes that she'd noticed from the first moment and attributed to his nature rather than to what it might actually be, the early stages of a body beginning tentatively to recover from something it had been fighting for months. Thomas, she said, you're not giving him that compound again, not a single dose. No, ma'am. And when Fields comes on Tuesday's tomorrow, Edward said. She stopped. Tuesday is tomorrow, he repeated. It's Monday evening, Catherine. You arrived later in the day than you perhaps realized. She looked at the window at the low angle of the light she'd been too focused to pay attention to. He was right. The afternoon had gone entirely while she'd been reading, and the light through the curtain edge was the amber of early evening, not afternoon. Jonathan Fields would be here in the morning. She sat back down at the writing table. All right, she said. Then we have tonight. She started with the February records again, this time moving faster, building a sequence. She called out details, and Edward confirmed or corrected them from memory, sharp, precise, never uncertain. His memory was extraordinary. She told him so without thinking. I've had nothing to do for 4 months but lie here and think, he said. You develop a very good memory, or you lose your mind. I chose the former. What else have you been thinking about? A pause. Whether anyone would come who could actually help. Another pause shorter. I'd begun to doubt it. She kept her eyes on the page. Victor sent me here to get rid of me. I know. He expected me to arrive, find you dying, and either leave quietly or stay quietly and become inconvenient to no one. Yes. He clearly underestimated you, Edward said. She looked up at that. He was watching her with those steady gray eyes, and there was no flattery in it, no performance of admiration. He said it the way he said everything, like a fact he'd assessed and confirmed. He underestimated both of us, she said. The half-smile returned. Small. Real. They worked through the evening without stopping. Thomas brought food, simple things easy to manage, and she made Edward eat not asking permission, simply placing the plate within reach and watching until he did. He ate without comment. She appreciated that too. By 9 o'clock, she had a complete timeline. By 10, she had a written analysis of the compound discrepancies. By 11, she had a theory tight enough that she would have staked a formal argument on it, and the anger she'd been keeping at careful distance had started to push through. "Fields is coming tomorrow," she said, "and I want to be in this room when he does." Edward was quiet for a moment. "He won't like that." "I know. He'll go straight to Victor. I'm counting on it." She set down her pen. "Victor sent me here because he thought I was powerless. A woman with no standing, no allies delivered to a dying man's house. Everything I do here, every step I take, he's already decided I can't do anything with." She paused. "I want him to keep thinking that. I want Fields to report back to Victor that I'm here, that I'm docile, that I'm managing household affairs and causing no trouble. I want Victor comfortable." She looked at Edward. "Comfortable men make mistakes." Edward looked at her steadily. "You've been planning this since this afternoon," he said. "Not an accusation, an observation." "I've been planning something like this since I was 14 years old," she said. "Victor just gave me the occasion." The night settled around the house. The heat didn't break. Carolina summer had no mercy, but it softened slightly toward midnight, enough that Catherine opened the curtain edge 2 inches and let the dark, warm air move through the room. She'd pulled her chair closer to the bed to share the single lamp, and the two of them had been speaking in low voices for hours now, the way people speak when they've passed the point of social performance and arrived somewhere more honest. She'd learned that he'd inherited Blackthorn at 26 after his father's sudden death. That the estate had been mismanaged by 3 decades of bad decisions, and he'd spent the following 8 years quietly correcting them. That he'd built 3 working relationships with men he trusted, men who were not notably Jonathan Fields or Victor Hamilton, and that Victor had inserted himself into his orbit through a mutual business acquaintance 18 months ago. "He's very good at that," Catherine said. "Inserting himself, presenting himself as an ally and becoming one until the moment it stops serving him." "How long were you engaged to him?" She turned the pen in her fingers. 2 years. "You didn't know." "I suspected." She was honest about it. "I chose not to examine what I suspected because the alternative was frightening. Victor Hamilton is the kind of man who provides security, a home, a name, a defined place in the world. I knew what he was on some level. I chose security over certainty." She paused. "I was wrong to do that." "You were practical," Edward said. "I was afraid." She set down the pen. "Those aren't the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. "No, they're not." At some point past midnight, she heard his breathing change and looked up to find that he'd fallen asleep, still propped against the headboard, his head fallen sideways slightly, his face in sleep losing about 10 years, and most of the pain that waking kept carefully managed. She worked for another hour. She compiled everything she had into a single document, clean, organized, the kind of record that could be set before a court or a medical board and read by someone who had never met either of them. She dated it, noted the sources, cross-referenced Thomas's record against Fields's official account. She was precise and thorough and deliberately unemotional, the way she'd learned from 11 years of needing to be taken seriously in rooms where no one wanted to take her seriously. When she finally set down her pen, the document was 12 pages. She sat back and looked at it. 12 pages that could end Jonathan Fields' practice. 12 pages that connected Fields to Victor Hamilton in ways Victor had apparently believed were invisible. 12 pages that told the story of a man left to die quietly and the woman who had been sent to watch it happen. She looked at Edward sleeping. He had held himself together for 4 months on nothing but Will and Thomas's second-hand loyalty and the stubborn refusal to die without understanding why. He had looked at her when she walked through his door, a stranger his captors cast off, and asked her an honest question, and accepted an honest answer, and extended her the basic dignity of treating her as a person capable of reason. She had met Victor Hamilton's associates for 2 years. She had never once felt this. She folded the document carefully and placed it in her leather case. Tomorrow, Jonathan Fields was coming. She was going to be ready. She was still sitting there, her chin in her hand, and her eyes on the middle distance, and her mind 3 moves ahead, when Thomas appeared silently in the doorway at 6 in the morning, and said in a tone of profound understatement, "Ma'am, doctors arrived early." Catherine straightened. Early. Fields had come early. She looked at Edward awake now, eyes open, watching her with that steady gray attention. He'd heard. His jaw was set. "Send him up," Catherine said. Thomas blinked. "Ma'am, he's asking to see the Duke alone." "I heard what he asked." She stood, smoothed her dress, and picked up the 12-page document from the leather case. "Send him up." The footsteps on the stairs were heavy, confident. A man who expected no resistance, who had been walking up these stairs for 4 months, unchallenged. Jonathan Fields stepped into the doorway and stopped. He was shorter than she remembered, broader. He had the well-fed look of a man whose practice had become very comfortable, and his eyes, when they found her and sharpened, were exactly as she remembered them: dismissive, assessing, recalculating. "Miss," he looked at Edward. "Your Grace, I wasn't informed you had company." "She's not company," Edward said. "She's my medical consultant." Field's eyes returned to Catherine. The recalculation was happening rapidly now. She could see it. Who is she? Why is she here? What does she know? "I don't believe we've met," he said. "We have," Catherine said. "You treated my mother for 2 years, Eleanor Whitmore. You dismissed every observation I made about her condition and refused every treatment adjustment I suggested." She held the document at her side, easy, not threatening yet. 3 of those adjustments were later implemented by her next physician and extended her life by 38 months. The silence was complete. Field's face had gone very still. "I don't recall." "You don't need to recall it." She lifted the document. "What you need to do, Dr. Fields, is sit down. Because I've spent the last 10 hours going through your records and I have some questions." Fields didn't sit down. That was the first thing. A man who sat down accepted the terms of the conversation. A man who stayed standing was still deciding whether he had to. He stood in the doorway with his bag in his hand and his eyes moving between Catherine and Edward, and Catherine watched him calculate. She'd seen that calculation before in her mother's parlor, in the hallway outside the sick room, in every room where Jonathan Fields had ever been asked to account for himself, and had decided each time that he didn't have to. "Your Grace," Fields said, addressing Edward directly, deliberately excluding her. "I'm not certain what's been suggested to you, but I must caution against accepting medical opinion from someone without formal qualification." "She has more qualification than you've demonstrated in 4 months," Edward said. Fields's mouth closed. "Sit down, Jonathan," Edward said. The use of his first name, flat, deliberate, landed like a hand on the shoulder. Not friendly, restraining. "She's going to ask you questions. You're going to answer them." Fields looked at Catherine. She could see the moment he made his decision, the slight squaring of the shoulders, the shift into performance. She'd seen that too. The performance of the competent man, slightly put upon, tolerating interference from below. "Miss Whitmore, is it?" he said. "I understand you've been reviewing my records. That's quite irregular, but I'm happy to address any confusion." "Page 14, she said. "March the 9th. You recorded the Duke's appetite as improving. Thomas's concurrent record indicates he didn't eat supper that evening and reported severe stomach pain the following morning. Explain the discrepancy." Fields blinked. Just once. "Patient self-reporting is inconsistent." Page 22. April the 3rd. You noted reduced pain. Thomas's record indicates the Duke was audible through a closed door in the night hours. She kept her voice even. Explain that discrepancy. A single difficult night doesn't... I have 11 discrepancies, Dr. Fields. She lifted the document. 11 instances across 5 months where your official record contradicts a concurrent observation by a household member. Not complaints, not impressions. Dates, times, specific symptoms, specific observations. She paused. Would you like to explain all 11, or would you prefer to begin with the compound you added in May? The room was absolutely silent. Fields's performance slipped. Just slightly a tightening around the mouth, a shift of weight. But she caught it because she'd been watching for it. The digestive tonic was a standard addition. At that concentration administered over 12 consecutive weeks, the primary ingredient does not aid digestion. It impairs the body's ability to process nutrition. She held his gaze. I documented this exact effect 11 years ago while managing my mother's care under your supervision. You dismissed my observation. The next physician confirmed it. She let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. I would like to know who directed you to prescribe it. Fields drew himself up. I don't take direction from Victor Hamilton, Edward said. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Fields went completely still. I have the letter, Edward said. March the 14th. Your handwriting his seal. My solicitor retained the original when Hamilton submitted your recommendation, and I requested the full correspondence file 2 weeks ago. I've had a great deal of time to read. His voice was quiet, certain. You wrote to Hamilton in March, confirming that my condition was, quote, progressing as anticipated. You used that exact phrase, progressing as anticipated. A pause. A doctor treating a patient for genuine illness does not describe that patient's decline as anticipated, Jonathan. That word implies a plan. The silence stretched. Fields looked at the document in Catherine's hands. He looked at Edward. He looked at the door measuring distance, and Catherine watched Thomas shift almost imperceptibly in the hallway, just enough to make clear that the distance to the door was not as useful as it appeared. I want to speak with Hamilton, Fields said. I imagine you do, Catherine said. Sit down. He sat. What followed was not a confession, not exactly. Fields was too careful for confession, too practiced at the sideways truth. But under an hour of precise, relentless questioning, Catherine with the document, Edward with the letters, Thomas confirming details from the doorway, a shape emerged that was damning enough. Victor Hamilton had approached Fields in February. He had presented the case as simple enough: a duke in declining health who needed careful management. Prolong the illness. Keep him incapacitated. Prevent recovery without causing obvious harm. The estate's financial affairs in the Duke's continued incapacity would pass to a temporary steward, a steward who happened to be one of Hamilton's business associates. Not murder. More elegant than that. A slow, deniable theft dressed up as natural decline. Fields had convinced himself Catherine suspected that it was nearly victimless. A sick man kept sick. No sudden death to investigate. Just a quiet arrangement that paid very well. The compound, Catherine said. You stop administering it today. Fields looked up. If I stop the compound abruptly, the withdrawal... I know the withdrawal profile. I'll manage it. She held his eyes. You will submit a corrected record to the county medical board by the end of this week. Every falsified entry corrected. Your own signature on the correction. She paused. Or I submit this document to the board myself, along with the letter establishing your arrangement with Hamilton, and you explain to them in a formal proceeding why you described a patient's decline as anticipated. Fields's jaw worked. You can't? I can. She kept her voice level. And I will. The only question is whether you cooperate before I do it or after. He left, 40 minutes later. No dose administered. No pleasantries. He walked down the stairs and out the front door with his bag in his hand and the expression of a man reassessing every decision that had brought him to this particular morning. Thomas closed the front door behind him and came back upstairs. He'll go straight to Hamilton, Thomas said. Yes, Catherine said. Then Hamilton will come here. Yes. She was already at the writing table pulling out fresh paper. That's what we need him to do. Edward was watching her. He'd pushed himself upright in the bed, more energy than yesterday, she noted. Small, but real. You want Hamilton to come here. I want Hamilton to come here believing he still has control of this situation. She dipped her pen. He'll think Fields warned him early enough to intervene. He'll come to manage me, to remind me of my position, my dependence, the terms of our engagement. She paused. He won't come expecting that I've spent the last 24 hours building a legal case. A legal case requires a lawyer. I know. She wrote the first line of a letter. Who is the most respected attorney in the county who is not connected to Victor Hamilton? A pause. Then Edward said, James Caldwell. He's in Raleigh. He handled my father's estate. Another pause, quieter. He's an honest man. I'd stake my life on it. You may have to. She kept writing. I'm writing to him now. Thomas? She looked up. How quickly can a writer reach Raleigh? Hard writing 4 hours. Can you send someone you trust? Thomas's expression was answer enough. My nephew. He's 17, and he's got no particular love for Dr. Fields. Send him within the hour. The letter went out before noon. The rest of the day moved differently than the one before, faster charged, the way the air changes before a storm. Catherine ate properly for the first time, standing at the writing table, and made Edward eat again, and the two of them worked through the afternoon, building the second half of what she'd started the night before. The financial records, the estate stewardship paperwork, the specific mechanisms by which Hamilton's business associate had been quietly inserting himself into Blackthorn's affairs during Edward's incapacity. It was meticulous work. It was also, Catherine realized about 3 hours in, genuinely interesting. You understand estate law, Edward said. He sounded surprised. My father was an estate manager. Not a wealthy man, he worked for wealthy men. But he taught me how these systems function because he said ignorance was the most expensive luxury a person could indulge. She turned a page. I suspect he hoped the knowledge would serve me in managing a household someday. I don't think he anticipated this exact application. He sounds like a practical man. He was. She was quiet for a moment. He died when I was 16, 2 years into my mother's illness. She didn't say it with performance, just with the plain fact of it. After that, it was just the two of us, her and me, and the knowledge he'd left behind. And Victor Hamilton offered stability, Edward said. Victor Hamilton offered a ceiling. She said it without bitterness. The bitterness had burned itself out somewhere around 3 a.m. A defined, comfortable ceiling, and I told myself that was enough. She turned another page. It wasn't. Edward was quiet for a moment. What would be enough? She looked up. He was watching her, that steady, serious attention that she'd stopped finding unsettling sometime around midnight and started finding something she didn't have a clean word for yet. Something that felt like being actually seen. I don't know, she said honestly. I haven't had occasion to consider it properly. My life has been largely organized around other people's needs. She held his gaze. Ask me in a month. His expression did the thing again, the small, involuntary shift, the crack in the careful surface. In a month, he said, I intend to be considerably less horizontal. Good, she said. You'll be more useful. He almost laughed. The almost was enough. The night came hot and still. Catherine had moved the writing table to allow the door to stay open, which let the hall air circulate, and also meant Thomas could hear if he was needed. She'd administered the first day of the withdrawal protocol, careful, incremental, precisely the opposite of what Fields had been doing, and Edward had tolerated it better than she'd feared. Better than she'd feared, but not without cost. By 9 o'clock, he was running a fever, not the high, dangerous kind. Not yet. A low fever. The body beginning to shift, beginning to do something it had been prevented from doing for months. She'd expected it. She sat close and monitored it and kept her hands busy with the remaining records and did not let herself show the fear that was present, quiet and controlled in the back of her mind. Tell me something, Edward said. His voice was rough with the fever but focused. What would you like to know? Anything, something that isn't about Fields or Hamilton or the records. A pause. Something real. She thought for a moment. When I was 12 years old, I found a book in my father's study that was supposed to be for physicians only. A medical text translated from French. He'd bought it at auction without knowing what it was. She turned a page she wasn't reading. I read the entire thing in 4 days. I understood about a third of it. I went back a year later and understood more. By the time I was 16, I'd read it through 5 times, and I understood nearly all of it. She paused. No one ever knew I had it. I kept it under the floorboard beneath my bed. Why hidden? Because it wasn't a book that girls were supposed to have. She looked at him. And because if I kept it secret, no one could take it from me. The silence was warm. I have 300 books in the library downstairs, Edward said. You're welcome to all of them. She looked at him. When this is over, he said, not as an offer of payment, not as generosity from owner to dependent. As the simplest possible statement of fact, this is yours if you want it. She looked back at her page. Thank you. The fever climbed slightly past midnight. Not dangerous, she'd established the threshold in her notes, and it hadn't reached it, but uncomfortable, and she found herself doing what she'd done for her mother in the bad nights, simply staying present. Not fussing. Not performing calm for the sake of it. Just being in the room, available, a point of steadiness in the dark. Around 2 a.m, Edward said very quietly, "Why hasn't anyone done this before?" She understood what he meant. "Because you appeared to be dying," she said. "And dying men are easier to walk past than to stop and look at." "You stopped." "I was sent here with nowhere else to go." She was honest about it. "But yes, I stopped." He was quiet. "Catherine." The way he said her name was different at 2 a.m, in the dark, with the fever making everything closer. Less formal. More like something he'd been thinking for a while. "I'm sorry you were put in this position." "Don't be." She kept her voice steady. Victor meant it as a punishment. It wasn't. She felt him look at her. She kept her eyes on the page she was pretending to read. "No," he said after a moment. It wasn't. The fever broke just before dawn. She knew it happened because she'd been monitoring his temperature with her hand to his forehead, at intervals clinical careful, and at 5:47 in the morning, she pressed her palm to his skin and felt the shift. The heat releasing. The body releasing it willingly, the way a clenched fist finally opens. She sat back in her chair and breathed. "It broke," she said. "I know." His voice was clearer than it had been in hours. "I can feel it." "How do you feel?" A pause. "Hungry." She laughed, a short, genuine sound she hadn't planned. And she saw it land on him, the surprise of it, like she'd handed him something he didn't expect. "That is the best symptom you could possibly report," she said. Thomas appeared in the doorway at 6, took one look at Edward's face, and disappeared toward the kitchen without being asked. Edward pushed himself more upright in the bed. More easily than before. He looked at his own hands, examining them the way she'd examined them yesterday, checking, assessing. Then he looked at her. "You haven't slept," he said. "I'll sleep later." "Catherine." "I'll sleep later," she said again, and this time there was something in her voice that closed the subject gently, the way you close a door without latching it. He let it go. Thomas came back with food, and they were quiet together, while Edward ate real eating, not the managed, effortful swallowing of the past days, but genuine appetite, the body insisting on itself. Catherine watched it happen, and felt the specific satisfaction of a thing that has been broken beginning to mend. She was refilling the water glass when they heard it. Hoofbeats on the gravel drive. Fast. More than one horse. Thomas appeared at the window edge, not opening the curtain, just angling to see, and his face went tight. "Hamilton," he said. Catherine set down the pitcher. She'd expected this. She had expected this, had planned for, it had spent 2 days building toward exactly this moment. She knew what she had to do. She knew what she had to say. She had the document. She had the letters. She had the corrected records. But knowing a storm is coming and standing in it when it arrives are 2 entirely different things, and for exactly 4 seconds, she stood in the middle of that room, with her heart hammering and the full weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her chest. Then Edward said quietly, "I'm not dying, Catherine. I want you to walk down those stairs knowing that." She looked at him. He held her gaze, steady, certain. Something in his eyes that was not pity and not strategy and not the complicated obligation of a man who owed her something. Just the plain, direct acknowledgement of one person to another. I see you. I am here. You are not alone in this. She picked up the document. Tell Thomas to show him to the front parlor, she said. I'll be down in 5 minutes. She took those 5 minutes. She washed her face. She repinned her hair. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and looked at the woman who had arrived at this house 2 days ago, delivered as someone else's discarded inconvenience. She looked considerably different than that woman now. She wasn't entirely sure she could explain why. Only that something had settled in her, some long-deferred sense of standing on ground that belonged to her, that she had earned, that no one had handed her. She picked up the document and walked down the stairs. Victor Hamilton was standing in the front parlor with his hat in his hands, and his easy, practiced confidence arranged carefully across his face. He turned when she entered. His expression did the thing it always did, the smooth, rapid assessment, the brief recalculation, the settling into the appropriate performance. Catherine. He smiled. I heard you'd arrived safely. I came to see how you're settling in. She stood in the doorway. She looked at that smile. The smile she'd seen every day for 2 years. The smile that had watched her board a carriage to a dying man's house and said, if you return. She looked at it the way she'd looked at Field's records carefully, without flinching past the surface of it to the structure underneath. Victor, she said, we need to talk about Jonathan Fields. The smile didn't waver. Of course. I understand he's been attending the Duke. We need to talk about the letter you sent him in March. She lifted the document. And the phrase progressing as anticipated. And the financial arrangement with your associate regarding the Blackthorn Estate stewardship. She held his gaze across the room. Sit down, Victor. His smile went very still. Victor Hamilton had never been told to sit down by a woman in his life. Catherine could see that in the precise frozen quality of his stillness, the way the command landed on him, like something foreign, something his body didn't have a rehearsed response to. For 3 full seconds he stood exactly as he was, hat in hand, smile arrested mid-performance. Then he sat, not because he'd accepted the terms, because he was smart enough to understand that standing while she stood with that document in her hand put him at a disadvantage he needed to think his way around. Victor Hamilton always needed to think his way around things. That was what he did. That was Catherine now understood the only thing he did. You've been busy, he said. His voice had shifted, the social warmth gone something flatter underneath it. I have. She remained in the doorway. Distance was information. She wasn't crossing the room to sit across from him. She wasn't placing herself in the arrangement of equals having a conversation. She was standing at the threshold of a room she had every right to be in, and he was the one who'd come here. I've also had help. From a bedridden man. From a man who kept his correspondence and his mind intact while someone tried to take everything else from him. She let that settle. The letter Victor, March the 14th, your seal, Field's handwriting. Victor set his hat on the side table with the deliberate care of a man deciding how much to spend. I don't know what you think that letter, progressing as anticipated. She said it the way he'd written it, flat, clinical, the phrase of a man managing a business outcome. That is not the language of a man who recommended a physician to an ailing acquaintance out of generosity. That is the language of a man who expected a specific result and was receiving confirmation of it. You're a woman with no legal standing reading correspondence that doesn't belong to you and drawing conclusions that a court would never. James Caldwell arrives tomorrow. Victor stopped. The name did what she'd needed it to do. James Caldwell was not a man Victor could dismiss, could root around, could charm with that smile. James Caldwell was 60 years old and had argued cases before the state legislature, and had Catherine had learned in Edward's telling, turned down Victor Hamilton's request for representation 8 months ago on the grounds that he didn't like what he'd heard about the man's business practices. Victor had heard the name, and behind his pale eyes the calculation was happening fast. You've been here 2 days, he said, and now the flatness in his voice had an edge to it. 2 days was enough. Catherine. He shifted. A new performance, she could see him selecting it the way you select a tool from a belt. Reasonable. Concerned. The voice he used when she'd questioned something and he needed to redirect her. I understand you're upset. You were sent here in a way that must have felt, don't. The word came out clean and quiet and completely without heat. That was what surprised him. Not anger, not tears, just the simple refusal of a woman who had spent the last 48 hours getting very clear about what she would and wouldn't accept. Don't do that. Don't manage me. We are past that. His jaw tightened. You sent me here to disappear, she said. Not to die, you're too careful for that. But to be placed in a situation so irregular, so compromising, that whatever I said or did afterward could be attributed to a woman of questionable judgment who'd spent unchaperoned weeks in a sick man's house. She watched his face. That's what you planned, isn't it? Not my death. My discrediting. The silence confirmed it better than speech would have. Because I got closer to something, she said. In the last months, something I saw or heard or nearly understood made me dangerous to you, and you needed me placed somewhere that would ruin my credibility before I could use it. She paused. What was it, Victor? What did I almost find out? He stood up. The movement was controlled but fast, the decision made quickly, the performance abandoned. The real Victor Hamilton, the one that lived underneath the charm, was standing in front of her now, and she felt the shift in the room, the way you feel a temperature drop. He was not a physically dangerous man, she'd always known that. He was a dangerous man, the way rot is dangerous quietly from the inside, using structures that were already there. You have no idea, he said low and precise, what you've stepped into. This arrangement with Blackthorn's estate is one component of something considerably larger. Fields is one physician. My associate is one steward. What you've assembled in 2 days is a corner of a room that you cannot see the full dimensions of. He stepped toward her. Walk away from this, Catherine. Take the engagement. Take the house, the name, the stability you've always wanted. Walk away, and I will make sure Caldwell never has reason to come to Blackthorn at all. She looked at him. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the records. Past the surface, into the structure. There it is, she said quietly. There what is. The offer. The managed retreat. She held the document steady at her side. You've just told me this is bigger than one physician and one estate. You've just confirmed that there is a larger structure worth protecting. She met his eyes. Thank you for that. Victor's expression went to stone. You're going to regret this, he said. I've regretted a great many things. She stepped aside from the doorway, not retreating, opening it. Victor, you need to leave this house. He looked at her for a long moment. She held the look without flinching, without performance, just with the plain, steady attention of a woman who had made her decision and was done deliberating. He picked up his hat. He walked to the door. He paused at the threshold, and she expected one more thing. One more word. One last attempt, the way a fire makes one last surge before it goes out. But he only said without turning. When Caldwell comes, he'll find more than you expect. Make sure you're prepared for that. Then he was gone. She heard his boots on the steps. She heard the horses. She heard the sound diminish down the drive and finally disappear into the summer heat. She stood in the empty parlor for 10 seconds. Then she walked back upstairs. Edward was sitting up fully in the bed, not propped, sitting his back straight, the first time she'd seen him unsupported. His color was better. Not good, not healthy, but no longer the gray of a man the body was giving up on. The fever had done its work and gone, and what was left was thin and tired and more present than he'd been since she arrived. He looked at her face. How did it go? He's gone. She sat down. The energy she'd been running on for 2.5 days was beginning to ebb, and she felt it now in her legs, in her shoulders, in the slight looseness behind her eyes. He told me this is bigger than fields and one estate. He confirmed it without meaning to. Edward was quiet for a moment. I was afraid of that. What do you know? He exhaled slowly. Before I became ill in the weeks before, when I was still moving, Still meeting with people, I was approached by two other landowners. Men I knew slightly, men whose estates bordered mine or whose families had history with mine. Both of them had gone through similar periods of financial difficulty in the past year. Both had accepted stewardship assistance from an outside associate during those periods. He paused. Neither of them had been ill, but both of them had been managed, their accounts redirected, their decisions quietly rerouted through the associate. He looked at her. I started asking questions. 3 weeks later, I got sick. The weight of it settled in the room. How many estates? Catherine asked. At minimum 4, possibly more. His voice was steady, but she could hear what it cost him, the controlled fury of a man who'd spent months lying helpless while something spread that he'd been about to stop. Hamilton isn't stealing estates outright. He's positioning himself as the essential man, the one who manages, the steward, who influences the decisions, who quietly redirects enough that over 5 or 10 years, the family wealth flows toward his interests, without any one event articulating what happened, until someone asks questions. Until someone asks questions, he agreed. And then that someone gets a physician recommended to them. Catherine stared at the middle distance. 4 estates. Possibly more. A physician. A network of stewards. A pattern of incapacitation illness for the ones who resisted financial pressure, for the ones who didn't. And Victor Hamilton at the center of it, unreachable because each individual piece was deniable, and the full shape of the thing required someone to stand back far enough to see it whole. Caldwell needs all of it, she said. Not just what happened here, all 4 estates. I have names. Edward reached to the bedside table, the movement still effortful but deliberate, and picked up a folded paper. I wrote them down last night, after you fell asleep in the chair. She looked at him. You were asleep for about 90 minutes, he said. You looked like you needed it, so I let you alone. He held out the paper. I also wrote down every financial irregularity I could recall from my pre-illness correspondence with Hamilton's associate. Dates, amounts, the specific language they used. He paused. I've had 4 months to remember things. I've been waiting for a reason to write them down. She took the paper. 4 pages, dense and precise, in a hand steadier than she'd have expected. Names, dates, amounts. The geography of a fraud assembled from memory alone, during a fever in the hours while she slept. She looked up at him. Edward, she said. This is extraordinary. He looked away, not embarrassed exactly, but as though the direct acknowledgement cost him something, as though he'd spent enough time being helpless that competence felt unfamiliar to be praised for. She recognized that feeling. She'd felt it for years. It's what I could remember, he said. It's enough. She folded the paper and placed it with the document. When Caldwell arrives tomorrow, we give him all of it. Your records, my analysis, the letter, the financial discrepancies, the names of the other estates. She paused. He'll need to move carefully. Hamilton warned me there's more than we can see yet. That might be a threat, or it might be the truth. Both, probably. Yes. She thought for a moment. Victor isn't stupid. He knows Caldwell is coming. He'll spend tonight arranging his defense, what to hide, what to explain away, who to discredit first. She looked at the document. He'll try to discredit me. He'll say I'm a hysterical woman who misread records she had no authority to access. He'll say our engagement was troubled, and this is a vendetta. She paused. He'll be very convincing. Then we make sure Caldwell doesn't need to take your word for it, Edward said. Everything we give him has to stand on its own. Dates, documents, Thomas's records, the other estates. Nothing that requires believing a woman over a man. He said it without inflection, not criticism, just the plain acknowledgement of how the world worked and what that required them to do. She appreciated that. The refusal to pretend the difficulty didn't exist. We'll need statements from the other estate owners, she said. I can write to them tonight. Will they respond? One will, Jonah Mercer. He's been angry since January, and he's been afraid to say so alone. Edward's voice was certain. He won't be afraid if he's not alone. They worked through the afternoon with the particular focused energy of people who understand that time is short. Thomas brought food at intervals and accepted without comment that neither of them was going to stop to eat properly. By 4 o'clock, the package for Caldwell had grown from Catherine's 12 pages to 27 Edward's financial analysis. The name's a formal letter from Edward himself in his capacity as Duke, requesting Caldwell's representation, and a second letter to Jonah Mercer, drafted in terms precise enough to communicate the full situation without being actionable if intercepted. At 4:30, Thomas's nephew rode out again toward Raleigh. At 5, a visitor arrived that none of them had anticipated. Thomas came upstairs with the particular expression he wore when something had happened that required the Duke's attention immediately. "Ma'am, sir, there's a woman downstairs. Says her name is Margaret Aldridge. Says she's Jonah Mercer's sister." He paused. "Says she's been trying to get someone to listen to her for 3 months, and she heard from someone in town that something was happening at Blackthorn." Catherine and Edward looked at each other. "Something in town," Catherine said. "Fields," Edward said. He couldn't keep his mouth shut. He told someone who told someone. By now, half the county knows there's been a disruption at Blackthorn. And Margaret Aldridge decided to come see for herself. Catherine was already standing. "Show her up, Thomas." Thomas hesitated. "She's quite emphatic, ma'am." "Good." She straightened. "I've had enough of quiet women." Margaret Aldridge was 53 years old, broad-shouldered, and wearing the expression of a woman who had driven a significant distance on a very hot day and was in absolutely no mood for evasion. She looked at Catherine, looked at Edward, looked at the papers spread across every surface of the room and said, "You found it." "We found part of it," Catherine said. "Sit down. Tell me what you know." What Margaret Aldridge knew was in several specific ways more than any of them had assembled. As Jonah Mercer's unmarried sister, she'd lived in his household for 20 years and managed his correspondence for the last 5 quietly, without formal authority, because Jonah was a good man who didn't understand paperwork and needed someone who did. She'd watched Hamilton's associate insert himself into Jonah's finances. She'd tracked 3 transactions that couldn't be explained by any legitimate business purpose. She'd written twice to a lawyer in Raleigh, a different lawyer, and received no response. She pulled the letters from her bag. Originals carefully kept dated. 3 transactions. Specific amounts. A name Catherine hadn't heard before: a third associate, 1 level above the steward, 1 level below Hamilton. And that name appeared in 2 of Edward's financial discrepancies as well. The triangle completed. Edward looked at Catherine. "We have him." "We have the shape of him," she said. "Caldwell will have to build the case." She turned to Margaret. "Will your brother testify?" "My brother will do whatever I tell him," Margaret said with the matter-of-fact confidence of a woman long accustomed to that fact. "And I will testify myself." "There will be pressure," Catherine said. "Hamilton will come after your credibility. He'll say you're an unmarried woman with a grudge. He'll say you misunderstood what you were managing." Margaret looked at her steadily. "Miss Whitmore, I have been an unmarried woman with accurate information and no platform for 30 years. I know exactly what it costs, and I'm past caring about the price." She paused. "Are you going to use what I brought you or not?" Catherine felt something warm expand in her chest. "Yes," she said. "We are." The evening that followed was the most productive Catherine could remember in years. 4 people around a set of documents in a warm room, each with a specific piece of the picture. Each one necessary, none of them waiting for permission. Thomas contributed his records. Margaret contributed her letters. Edward contributed his memory and his authority and his signature. Catherine contributed the analysis that made it all cohere. At 9 o'clock, they had a case. Not a complete case. Caldwell would need to do the formal work, the legal construction, the court preparation. But they had evidence sufficient to compel a serious investigation, and a serious investigation was all they needed. Victor Hamilton's construction depended on no one looking carefully. Someone looking carefully was all it took. "He'll know what's happening," Edward said when the papers were finally ordered and Thomas had taken the packet to be locked in the estate strongbox. "Yes," Catherine said. He'll try something before Caldwell arrives. Probably. She was quiet for a moment. But he'll have to decide what he's willing to do with witnesses, with Thomas, with Margaret, with an estate that's no longer isolated. She paused. 2 days ago I was alone in this. I'm not alone anymore. Edward looked at her. He'd been looking at her all evening with something that had been building since the fever broke, since the moment she'd walked down those stairs to face Victor, with 12 pages and 2 days of no sleep, and nothing but her own certainty to back her up. He'd been watching her, the way a man watches something he didn't expect and can't stop looking at. "Catherine," he said, "I know." She said it quietly, not dismissing what was in his voice, just acknowledging that it existed, and that now was not yet the moment for it. "When this is over." He was quiet. "When it's over," he agreed. Margaret stayed the night Thomas's doing a room prepared with the efficiency of a man who anticipated needs before they were spoken. The house settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind that precedes resolution, when everything has been set in motion, and there is nothing to do but wait for morning. Catherine sat alone at the writing table for a while after the others had gone. She read through what they'd assembled. She found 2 small gaps and noted them for Caldwell. She was precise and thorough, and did not allow herself to feel the exhaustion fully, because there was still the night to get through. But sometime before midnight, in the quiet of the house, she let herself sit with it for just a moment. She had come here 2 days ago as someone else's discarded problem. She was leaving not yet, but eventually, and on her own terms, as something else entirely. She didn't have a word for it yet. She thought she might by the time it was over. The clock marked midnight. Tomorrow, James Caldwell would arrive. And somewhere across the county, Victor Hamilton was making his last calculations. James Caldwell arrived at 10 in the morning. He was exactly what Edward had described, 60 years old, unhurried, with the particular stillness of a man who had spent 4 decades listening to people tell him things and had learned that the most important information usually arrived in the pauses. He shook Edward's hand, nodded to Thomas, accepted the introduction to Margaret Aldridge without blinking, and then he looked at Catherine and the 27 pages she placed in his hands and said nothing for a long time. He read standing up, all of it, every page. No one spoke. Thomas had the good sense to bring coffee. Catherine stood near the window and watched Caldwell's face the way she'd watched Fields's face 2 mornings ago for the micro-expressions that tells the small involuntary signals that preceded the official response. What she saw was not what she expected. Caldwell turned the last page, set the document on the table, and looked at her directly. "Miss Whitmore, how long did this take you to assemble?" "The medical analysis one night, the financial documentation the following afternoon, the full packet with Mr. Mercer's correspondence added last evening, approximately 40 hours total." Caldwell looked at Edward. "She did this in 40 hours. "She did," Edward said. The old attorney was quiet for a moment. "I turned Hamilton down 8 months ago because I didn't like what I heard about him. I wish I had acted on that instinct more directly." He picked up the packet again. "This is sufficient to compel a formal investigation. More than sufficient. The medical falsification alone would end Fields's practice. Combined with the financial discrepancies and the correspondence establishing Hamilton's coordination." He paused. "This is a serious criminal matter, not a civil dispute." "How long?" Catherine asked. "To build a case that holds in court 3 months if the other estate owners cooperate." He looked at Margaret. "Mrs. Aldridge, your brother, can I count on him?" "You can count on me," Margaret said. "Jonah will follow." Caldwell almost smiled. "Then 3 months, possibly 2. He looked at the document again. "Hamilton will know I'm involved by this afternoon. He'll move quickly assets correspondence, anything that can be redirected or destroyed." He looked at Edward. "I need a formal letter of engagement today, and I need authority to request a court hold on the estate stewardship appointments across all 4 properties." "You'll have it within the hour," Edward said. Caldwell finally sat down, and the work began. The next 4 hours were the most legally intense Catherine had experienced since the worst of her mother's care disputes, Document by document, date by date, Caldwell building the architecture of the case with the methodical precision of a man who had won difficult cases before and knew exactly which details courts cared about and which they dismissed. He asked Catherine questions that no one had ever asked her before, precise technical, treating her analysis as the work of someone qualified to produce it. The third time he referenced her findings as Miss Whitmore's medical assessment, rather than the household woman's notes. She had to look away for a moment. It was a small thing. It shouldn't have meant as much as it did. It meant an enormous amount. By 2 o'clock, Caldwell had his engagement letter, his court hold request drafted, and a clear action list. He stood to leave and paused at the door. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "when this concludes, and it will conclude, I am confident of that the medical board review of Dr. Fields will require a formal complainant. Someone with standing who witnessed the falsification and can speak to the broader pattern." He looked at her steadily. "I'd like that person to be you." She held his gaze. "I'm not a physician. You don't need to be. You need to be what you are, an educated woman with documented evidence and 11 years of relevant experience." He paused. "The board won't like it. They'll push back on your standing. I'll push back harder." He held out his hand. "Do I have your agreement?" She shook it. "You do." After Caldwell left the house, exhaled, Margaret announced she was returning to her brother with the news and would have Jonah's formal statement to Caldwell within the week. She embraced Catherine before leaving, briefly, firmly, the embrace of a woman who had been carrying something heavy alone and had just found someone to carry the other side. She shook Edward's hand. She told Thomas he was a good man. Then she was gone, and her departure left the house quieter, in a way that felt like the quiet after a very long effort finally completed. Thomas disappeared to the kitchen. Catherine and Edward were alone. She was standing at the writing table, straightening papers that didn't need straightening, and she was aware of him watching her, and was not ready yet for what she could hear in that attention. She needed another moment, just another moment of being the woman with the document and the plan and the clear forward purpose before she had to be whatever came next. "Catherine," he said, "the withdrawal protocol needs another 4 days," she said. "I should stay through that, to make sure the transition is clean and there's no secondary reaction." "Yes," he said, "you should stay. And Caldwell may need additional documentation from me in the next week." "He may. So I'll stay for practical reasons," she said. "That's the reason." A pause. "Of course," Edward said, and she could hear the almost smile in it. She turned around. He was sitting fully upright, both feet on the floor. She hadn't seen that yet. Hadn't seen him fully vertical and self-supported, and the difference was striking. He was still thin. He would be thin for a while, yet the body reclaiming itself slowly. But the gray had gone from his face, and his eyes were clear, and he was looking at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded, in a way she suspected very few people had ever seen from him. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to hear it as a genuine question, not an obligation." She waited. "When this is over, the case, the investigation, Caldwell and the board and all of it, what do you want?" He held her gaze. "Not what's available to you, not what's practical. What do you actually want?" The question sat in the room. She'd been asked what she could manage, what she was suited for, what would be appropriate, what a woman in her position ought to consider. She had not been asked by anyone in recent memory what she wanted. "I want to practice medicine," she said. The words came out plainly without apology, the way truths do when they've been held back long enough that they've built up pressure. "Formally, if it ever becomes possible. Informally, if that's what's available. I want to use what I know." She paused. "I've been using it sideways my whole life, around the edges of what I was permitted in the margins of other people's recognized work. I want to stop doing it sideways." "Then do it properly," he said. "It isn't that simple. It's not simple at all," he agreed. "But simple and possible aren't the same thing." He paused. "Blackthorn Estate has a cottage on the east boundary. It was used as a physician's office when my grandfather ran the estate properly. It's been empty for 12 years. He looked at her steadily. I'm not offering it as payment. I'm not offering it as an obligation of gratitude. I'm offering it because the county has no decent medical care within 20 miles, and you are without question the most competent medical mind I have encountered, and because... He stopped. Because, she said. He held her gaze. Because I would like very much for you to stay. Not for 4 more days. Not for practical reasons. His voice was even deliberate, the voice he used when he was saying something precisely and meant every word of it. I would like you to stay because this house has been very quiet for a long time, and 4 days ago a woman walked into it with a leather case, and 40 hours later had built a case that is going to dismantle a fraud that 4 months of illness had convinced me I'd never be able to touch. He paused. I would like you to stay because when you laughed this morning I thought it was the best sound I'd heard in this house in years. Another pause, shorter. And I am aware that is a significant thing to say. Catherine stood very still. She thought about 2 years of a life arranged around a man who'd smiled at her and seen a useful piece on a board. She thought about the carriage ride to Blackthorn with her trunk and her leather case, and her hands shaking on her knees. She thought about the moment she'd walked into this room and found a man who'd looked at her like a question worth answering. Edward, she said. I know the timing is. The timing is terrible, she said. You're recovering from being poisoned. I have just ended a 2-year engagement. There is an active legal investigation in which we are both principal witnesses. She looked at him. The timing is objectively terrible. Yes. And I would like to stay, she said. The silence between them was the warm, full kind, not empty, not waiting, just present. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them needed to say anything else about it just yet. Then the moment broke the way good moments do naturally, and without drama. You need to eat, she said. I just ate. 2 hours ago. Your body is recalibrating. You need consistent nutrition every 2 hours for the next... Catherine. Yes. Sit down. She sat. Not because he told her to, because the chair was there, and the afternoon was warm, and she realized, tired in the deep, specific way of a person who has been running very hard and has finally reached a place where stopping is allowed. She sat, and he was quiet beside her, and outside the Carolina summer pressed on with its indifferent heat, and its screaming cicadas, and its absolute disregard for the human dramas conducted in its presence. 3 days later, the first sign of Victor Hamilton's collapse arrived in a letter Caldwell sent by express rider. Hamilton had attempted, on the morning after his visit to Blackthorn, to liquidate a significant portion of his accessible assets. The bank, alerted by Caldwell's court-hold request, had flagged the transaction. 2 of his associates, not the steward, but men, 1 level further removed men who had understood what Hamilton's exposure would mean for their own, had approached Caldwell independently within 24 hours of his filing. They were, Caldwell wrote in his precise, unhurried hand, being cooperative. Catherine read the letter aloud to Edward. When she finished, the room was quiet. He thought no one would ever look carefully, Edward said. He thought no one was in a position to. She folded the letter. He was nearly right. Nearly, Edward agreed. Thomas came in without knocking. He'd stopped knocking 2 days ago, by mutual unspoken agreement with the information that Jonah Mercer had arrived in person, driven 30 miles to add his voice to whatever was needed, and was waiting downstairs with his sister and a box of documents he'd been keeping under his own floorboard for 6 months. Catherine stood up. Edward stood up too. She looked at him fully vertical, steady on his feet, still thin, but present, the specific presence of a man who had decided to be alive and meant it. He met her eyes and held out his arm, not as ceremony, not as possession, just as the plainest possible offer. I'm here. Let me stand beside you. She took his arm. They walked downstairs together. Jonah Mercer was 50 years old, sunburned and visibly angry in the way of a man who'd been told for months that his instincts were wrong and had finally been vindicated. He stood when they entered. He looked at Edward, then at Catherine, then at the arm she held, and something shifted in his expression, a recalibration. "You're the woman who started this," he said to Catherine. "I'm the woman who had the evidence," she said. "The Duke kept the correspondence. Your sister kept the transaction records. Thomas kept 40 pages of daily notes." She met his eyes. "We all started it." Jonah Mercer looked at her for a moment. Then he held out his hand. "Ma'am, I'm glad you were sent here." "So am I," she said. She hadn't expected to mean it as fully as she did. The meeting with Caldwell's representative, a young lawyer named Henry Park, sent to take formal statements, lasted 3 hours. Jonah's documents filled the remaining gaps in the financial timeline. Margaret confirmed her own statement with additional detail she'd remembered overnight. Edward gave his formal account with the measured precision of a man who had been composing it in his head for 4 months and was finally permitted to speak it aloud. When Henry Park gathered the documents and prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Miss Whitmore," he said, with the slightly uncertain air of a young man choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Caldwell asked me to tell you personally that in 30 years of practice, he has not seen a private individual assemble a documentary case of this quality. He said to tell you that." She absorbed that quietly. "Thank you," she said. "Tell Mr. Caldwell I hope to return the compliment someday." Henry Park blinked, nodded, and left. Margaret caught Catherine's eye across the room and smiled a full, unguarded smile, the smile of a woman who understood exactly what had just been said and was glad to have been there for it. 6 weeks later, Jonathan Field surrendered his medical license, rather than face a formal board proceeding. 8 weeks after that, the county court issued an injunction against Victor Hamilton's estate management operations, freezing his financial activity, pending full investigation. 2 of his associates entered formal agreements with Caldwell's office. The third fled to Philadelphia and was located 10 days later. Victor Hamilton himself was served papers on a Wednesday morning. Thomas told Catherine about it later. He'd heard it from his nephew, who'd heard it from the county clerk. Victor had been in his front parlor when the process server arrived. He'd read the papers without visible expression. He'd set them on the side table precisely the way he set everything, with the careful control of a man who refused to show what he felt. Then he'd asked his housekeeper to cancel his afternoon appointments. That was all. Catherine heard that detail and thought, that's who he always was. Even now, even at the end, the performance was what he reached for. She did not feel triumphant. She felt with a clarity that surprised her, simply finished with it. The chapter closed. The accounting settled. What happened next was not the reversal of a wrong, so much as the natural conclusion of the truth. The truth that had been true all along, that she'd helped assemble and document and present in a form the world could act on. What happened next was hers. On the first morning she felt fully rested, 2 months after arriving at Blackthorn Estate, the Carolina summer finally beginning to soften toward fall. She walked to the east boundary of the property and looked at the cottage. It was small. It needed work. The roof wanted attention, and the windows wanted cleaning, and the garden around it had gone wild in 12 years of neglect. She stood there and thought about what it could be. She heard Edward behind her before he spoke. His step was familiar to her now. The particular rhythm of it, the way it had changed in 2 months, from the careful, effortful movement of a man conserving his energy to something easy and deliberate and like himself. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That the south window gets good light," she said. "You'd want good light for examination work, and the room on the left would make a decent waiting room if you took out the partition." She paused. "I'd need a cabinet for supplies, a proper writing table larger than the one upstairs, and eventually someone to help a woman from the county who could learn the intake procedures." He was quiet. "I'm thinking practically," she said. "I know." She could hear the smile. "I like it when you think practically." She turned to look at him. He was standing in the late summer morning light, recovered and present, and looking at her with that expression she still didn't have a clean word for, and had stopped needing one. He held out his hand, not to lead her anywhere, just the plain offer of it. The same offer he'd made on the stairs 6 weeks ago. She took it. "The cottage needs a name," she said. "It does. "I'm thinking Whitmore House," she said, "for practical reasons." He laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the sound she'd been collecting since the first time she'd accidentally caused it. She stored this one with the others. "For practical reasons," he agreed. She looked back at the cottage, at the south window, at the wild garden that would in spring be whatever she chose to make it. Catherine Whitmore had come to Blackthorn Estate as a debt paid, a problem disposed of, a woman placed somewhere she was expected to quietly disappear. She had come with a leather case and shaking hands and the slow-burning certainty of someone who had spent her whole life being underestimated and had finally at last found a place where that stopped. She had not disappeared. She had built something instead out of 40 hours and 11 years of hidden knowledge, and one man's kept correspondence, and an old servant's careful block letters, and a woman who drove 30 miles with a box of documents she'd been protecting under her own floor. She had built something, and it was hers, and it was going to stand.